It's fall and, school's back in session. School's one of those things, I think, that as a student and maybe, even as a parent, you drop your kids off or you show up to class and the day goes along and the bells ring and the things happen and you just take for granted that all of that is going to go on. And it's really a deal where, you don't always look behind the scenes to see the little things that have to happen in order for anything, a worship service, a day at school, all that stuff to happen. There was a principal in West Virginia who showed up at school one Wednesday morning, and he went about his normal Wednesday morning activities. He got there and was greeting teachers as they arrived, and then as the students started to pile into school, he went out to the front of the building to welcome students as they got off the bus and were dropped off by parents and all of those things. And as most of the students had gone into class, his custodian came over to him and said, "Hey, I'm having trouble at the dumpster." Evidently, they had some trouble with their dumpster, maybe animals getting in or neighbors utilizing it too much. And so they had gotten into the habit of padlocking their dumpster, and they had a digital padlock that they used to secure that lid. And the custodian, I don't know if he was new or what, he said, "I'm having trouble with it." So the principal went over with him and he unlocked the dumpster and took the padlock off, and he didn't notice anything, but as he went to lift the lid, before he could kind of swing that lid on top of the dumpster up and over, an animal, a bear, jumped out of the dumpster at him. I have a picture. It was caught on security footage. And you can see the principal fleeing, and the bear took off, maybe as scared as the principal was, and the bear ran away. And after the bear had gone back into the woods or whatever, and the principal asked the custodian, "You didn't hear anything when you were over by the dump trying to get the lid off? There was no noise?" And the custodian said, "No, I swear there was no noise." They think probably the bear had somehow, weaseled his way, squirmed his way under the lid at night and found a feast of whatever, leftover school lunches. Maybe it was chicken patty day, I don't know, but he found a feast of whatever was left over, had gorged himself and then fallen asleep in the dumpster, and they had startled this bear when they opened it up the next morning. I don't know, maybe you've been involved in just some kind of mundane, ordinary, everyday task, and then the unexpected happens. There's a surprise, something unexpected, and you have to reevaluate how you participate in that ordinary, everyday, kind of mundane activity. Look, I hate to admit it, but sometimes I think that as followers of Jesus, as believers, more accurately, as church people, sometimes we kind of get into the habit of being in a worship service, of participating in church things, and maybe we lose that expectation of something, out of the ordinary happening. We just start to open that lid every Sunday, and we kind of lose track that, man, there's something bigger than us involved in this process, and that maybe we ought to expect the unexpected. There is a worship service that's recorded for us in the book of Acts in chapter 20, verses 7 through 16, where the unexpected really happened, where they just didn't consider this occurring in their worship service. And we're gonna take a look at that story and just see what we can learn from it this morning. It's in Acts chapter 20, verses 7 through 16. If you have your Bibles, I'd love for you to open them there. Paul has been on this missionary journey. This is his third missionary journey, we call it. And he's been all over. We left him last week in Ephesus. And what we didn't tell you is that as he was preaching in the synagogue, and then he takes off and preaches next door to it and continues, and we left off telling you that all of Asia heard about Jesus. And truly, so many people had heard the story of Jesus and had given in to the story of Jesus that one of the main economic drivers of the area, the selling of religious knickknacks, idols, we would call them, these pagan idols, these handmade gods that they were peddling to the religious pilgrims, that took a nosedive. And folks got upset about that. And they got so upset that they started to say, look, this is only happening because of Paul and all these other Christians. And it resulted in a riot in Ephesus. This crowd of people gets together, and they're pulling out Christians into the great theater there in Ephesus. It seats like 24,000 people. And so there's this huge mob, and Paul's like, I've got to go settle these folks down. And his friends are saying, don't go in there. And even some of his friends involved in that pagan idol trade said, don't go in there, it's not going to be good. And so Paul stays away. Finally, an official from the city calms the riot down, says, look, you got to consider this. Rome's going to come in. It's going to be a bad deal. And so that quiets down. And Paul decides, it's time for me to go. I better head out of here. And so he leaves from Ephesus and he goes to Philippi. And then from Philippi, he goes to Corinth. And from Corinth, he intended to sail back to Antioch in Syria, back to his home church, his home base. And as he's getting ready to get onto the boat, word comes to Paul, hey, don't get on that boat because there are assassins on the boat with a plot, with a plan to kill you. And so Paul decides, I'm not going to get on the boat, and he goes back and heads back inland. He goes back to Philippi instead, and from Philippi he sends at least 7 missionaries on ahead to Troas. It reminds me, I have a map of the third missionary journey there, and it reminded me all these places that Paul goes. You can see the arrows kind of crisscrossing. It reminded me of the old Sunday comics. When I was a kid and you got the Sunday newspaper, and then there was the comics. And kids ask your parents what a newspaper is and ask them what a comic strip is. But one of my favorites was the Family Circus. And on Sunday, it was often this maze of this little boy going all through his neighborhood. He went here and there and kind of everywhere. And to me, the third missionary journey of Paul, and we're getting to that place where he's going here and there and kind of everywhere. His plans are changing, and he's trying to decide what to do exactly. And so he heads back, and he's in Philippi, sends the rest ahead. Paul and Luke catch up eventually to the other missionaries in Troas. And you remember just way back in chapter 16, there was a brief mention that Paul and Luke were in Troas before. And so they're having this reunion with the church there in Troas. And it's just a week-long celebration of all things. And it happens to conclude on Sunday. And so they're gonna celebrate in this church service on Sunday night together. And so the whole church gathers together in the space that they used for worship. Scripture tells us that it was on the 3rd floor. It was the 3rd story, probably the top of this building, I suppose, this 3-story building. And maybe in our world, we think of the penthouse at the top as kind of the fanciest place. Well, in the first century, that's not the story at all. We don't have the engineering. We don't have the security kind of stuff. We don't have, fire alarms and fire sprinklers. And so the sort of higher up you went on into a building in the first century, on the 3rd story in this case, the less good it was, the more dangerous it was. This was a humble place to hold a worship service. And they gathered together in this room, and Paul starts preaching. And he just kind of keeps preaching. And as he's preaching, the room is getting more and more full. And they are using these candles, these oil lamps to light the space. And as he preaches, the oil lamps are burning, and the smoke is smoking, and it's filling that room up. And just Paul continues to preach. And it's really amazing. They gathered together on that first day of the week to the focus of their worship service was communion, was to celebrate this agape feast. Now, we just celebrated communion. We typically celebrate communion at the center of our worship service, right? We want to keep it kind of as the central focus. And that was true all the way back with Paul and the church in Troas. But they gather together and they're anticipating this feast. Now, they didn't celebrate communion with a little cracker and a tiny cup of juice. They would celebrate with this agape feast. And it was a full meal. And sometimes, depending on sort of the economy of the area and the status of those worshiping, it was sort of a meal that really sustained people for maybe the entire week. They might not know where lunch is coming the next day, but they could count on this agape feast at church. And so it's a little amazing to me that as Paul preaches and as the room gets more and more smoky, that nobody's complaining, "Hey, Paul, let's get to it. We've got communion, the Lord's Supper, this agape feast, this supper is coming. Let's get to it." But nobody complains, and Paul just keeps on preaching. There was a young man named Eutychus who had come to that worship service, and Eutychus was probably like everyone else in that room. Sunday was a work day, and so he was coming to work, rushing to get there. And he gets to the building, and he goes to that third story, and he's looking in at this crowded space already. And he's thinking, man, it's so cool that the Apostle Paul is here. Maybe they'd had a letter circulate through, or he's remembering Paul's initial visit, and he's like, this is so awesome. I want to get as close to the apostle as he could. And so he's squirming his way through the crowd, I imagine. And he gets up as close to Paul as he could, and Paul is preaching, and he's like, this is so great. And then Eutychus, who has worked all day in the sun, and he's worn out from that, and he's looking forward to supper, and he's sitting there and he's listening, and he thinks, man, this is so awesome. But the smoke is filling the room, and his eyelids are getting heavy, and he soon realizes that maybe the front of the room wasn't the right call. And he starts to look around, and he spies towards the back an open window, and he thinks, fresh air, that's what I need. And so just like he squirmed his way to the front, he turns and he tries as stealthy as he could to get back out through the crowd, and he gets to the window, and he thinks, oh, this is going to be awesome. And he realizes I can kind of sit in this windowsill, and so he props himself up in the windowsill. Meanwhile, Paul is just preaching and preaching, and the fresh air helped for a minute. But sooner or later, those heavy eyelids were more than Eutychus could handle, and he fell asleep. I don't know if it happened right away after he fell asleep, or if it was like several minutes after he was kind of snoozing away. But Eutychus fell from that window 3 stories to the ground. If you want to stop a sermon, right, this is one way to do it, because it stopped the sermon. And everyone headed towards the exits. They were rushing down to see what had happened to Eutychus, and Paul was not far behind. I'm not sure, maybe it was the physician, the doctor, Luke, who goes up and looks at Eutychus first, and I imagine him kneeling down and checking him out, and I imagine Luke's face lifting up, and he's looking around for this kid's parents, this young man's parents in the room. Where are they at? And then he looks and he turns towards Paul, and Paul can see from the look, the expression on Luke's face, that it's not good news. And Paul, he runs up to Eutychus, and he kind of goes WWF on him, and body slams, chest to chest, face to face. He's laying on top of this young man. And at some point, I don't know, I wonder when Eutychus realized that, wow, the Apostle Paul is, laying on me. Or maybe he felt the breath from Paul as he exclaimed, hey, guys, don't worry. His life is in him. And Paul stands up, and Eutychus stands up. And then they go back up. This is extraordinary to me. I'm sure there's a celebration, there's gasps and exclamations, but they just climb the stairs back up to that 3rd floor room, and they go back to the communion celebration of that agape feast. And then what's more, Paul goes back to preaching. And he just preaches until morning. And then he decides it's time for me to head out. And Paul and his buddies are going to catch a boat. But Paul gets to the port and he says, look, guys, I think I'd rather walk. And so Paul, after preaching through the night, walks 21 miles to his next destination and eventually catches up with his friends on the boat. And they're heading back on this journey that will eventually take them back to Jerusalem. The unexpected, for sure, happens in this worship service. I just wonder, what do we expect when we gather together as a church? Do we really believe? Because guys, we can't miss this. This is so true. The gathering as the church offers real life. Every time. Every time. I think there are 3 expectations that it's fair for us to have when we gather together as the church, as body of believers, as Christ's hand and feet in this world. There's 3 expectations that it's fair for us to have. And we're going to walk through the story and think about them right now. Expectation number 1 is community. Verse 7 says, on the first day of the week when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. Paul just kept preaching here, but a couple things stand out to me beyond the fact that he preaches until midnight. The first thing that stands out is that they gathered together on the first day of the week. This is the first time in Acts where it's specifically mentioned that the church is meeting on Sunday. This is significant for a couple of reasons, I suppose. One is that, of course, the way the church grows out of Judaism, and Judaism was about not Sunday, but Saturday, the Sabbath. And so that was their tradition, and they held to the Sabbath, and it was a big deal. We're not going to go into it, but it's a big deal in Judaism, still is. And so they're serious about the Sabbath. And the Roman world, well, they didn't have, we kind of think about Saturday and Sunday as the weekend. That's our time. We're going to have those days off. We have this 5-day work week. And the Roman Empire certainly didn't have anything of the sort. And so Sunday was just another work day. It was one more day to get it done. And so they didn't have any concept of sort of this separate day just for worship. And for the church to gather on a Sunday was unique from their Jewish roots, and it was unique from the Roman Empire's perspective. And here the church is gathering on a consistent basis. That's what I kind of figure from verse 7 here in our story. It's not that this was kind of the tail end of this week-long celebration. It's that happened to coincide with their weekly meeting on Sundays anyway. But the biggest thing that stands out about them meeting on Sunday is that they were meeting at night. Why were they meeting at night? Well, because everybody probably worked all day long. And they made time to meet together. Just like in Ephesus, when Paul gets kicked out of the synagogue and he goes to the lecture hall and he starts to preach there, and then everybody is coming to the lecture hall in the middle of the day during lunch and nap time. They were sacrificing something in order to gather together. And the same thing's true of the church in Troas. They were making time to gather together. It was a big enough deal. It was important enough to them. They received this first expectation, enough comfort from gathering together that they were committed, even when it was hard, even when they were tired. Eutychus was worn out. And he showed up anyway. They gathered together. They made time to be together, to seek this comfort from Jesus and from one another. So they gathered together on the first day of the week. And then the center, the focus of their gathering was to break bread. All the way back to Acts chapter 2, when it talks about breaking bread, it's talking about communion. And so here they're gathered together to celebrate communion. Every week here at Wallula Christian Church, we do this as well. We want to keep communion at the center of our focus. David Faust, who's a preacher and author, said this about communion. He said, throughout history, Christ's followers have placed high value on the Lord's Supper. Whatever else takes place in our weekly worship gatherings, no matter what the sermon is about, or what songs we sing. The bread and the cup focus our attention on the central facts of our faith, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. The church's head said, do this. Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me. So communion should never be relegated to a place of unimportance or in our assemblies, nor should it be done mechanically and carelessly. Communion ought to be the center, our focus of our worship services. Every week it points us, it allows us, it gives us this opportunity to look back. We remember what Jesus did on the cross. We remember that he died, that he was buried, and that he rose from the grave on the third day. And so we look back. At the same time, we look forward at communion. We remember what Jesus has done, but we look forward to what Jesus has promised to do and that he's coming back again. And so we look back at what Jesus has already done for us. We look forward in expectation and hope of what he has promised to do someday in returning. We look up to God, who is sovereign, in charge. He's in control of all of history, no matter how it moves and sways from one direction to another. He's got this big plan for his people, and he's made a way. He's accomplished that plan through his son Jesus. We look back, we look forward, we look up to the sovereign, holy, righteous God. We look inward at ourselves. We examine ourselves. What does our relationship with Jesus look like? And oh, by the way, we don't just look back and look forward and look up and look inward, but we look outward. We celebrate communion not in seclusion, not alone, but we celebrate communion. They ate this agape feast, this meal together as a family. And so as we are eating that bread and drinking that juice, we are reflecting, yes, on our personal relationship with Jesus, but we're recognizing that we're a part of something greater than ourselves. That we can't have a relationship with Jesus alone. That we need each other, the comfort that one another, the comfort that, Jesus provides for us, but that we can provide one for another. We need this community, this community. I think I'm messing this up. It's community is number one. On the first day of the week, they gathered together for this community with one another. Expectation number two is comfort. I'm so excited to get there. Let's look at it right now. Verses 8 through 12 says this: there were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered, and a young man named Eutychus, sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. And being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down and bent over him, and taking him in his arms, said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a while longer until daybreak, and so departed. And they took the youth away alive and were not a little comforted. All right, and so Paul is preaching and preaching. Eutychus is sitting in the windowsill. At some point he falls asleep. He falls those 3 stories. Everybody rushes out. There's a doctor there. Luke goes down, checks him out. Some scholars debate about whether Eutychus was really dead or not. All right, and I think most of this is recency bias. We tend to believe that we've gotten so much smarter from our history in the past, but there's no reason for us to believe that these folks didn't know the difference between dead and alive, that they weren't able to judge this. And so when Scripture says that he's dead, I think Eutychus really died. The 3-story fall, and he's gone. And so the doctor's looking around, and Paul comes down, and Scripture, the ESV talks about him bending over and holding him in his arms, and really the language there is much more forceful, kind of, he lays on top of him. Maybe Luke wants us to remember a story from the Old Testament where the prophet Elijah, you might recall, at one point God said, "Elijah, I want you to go to this widow's house and she's going to provide for you." And so Elijah goes to the widow's house and God said, "Tell her to make some bread for you." And he said, "Will you make some bread for me?" And she's like, "I only got a little flour and enough oil for my son and I. We can't be making bread for you." And God said, "Tell her anyway." And so Elijah did, and she goes and she makes the bread. And then as long as Elijah's there, the oil never runs out. She has enough to sustain her family and Elijah for the entire time he's there. While Elijah is staying there, eating this woman's bread from this oil that doesn't run out, her son dies. And Elijah has this conversation with God. And I checked the Hebrew. I don't know Hebrew, but I checked the Hebrew, and I'm pretty sure it went like this. Right? God, come on. You got to be kidding me. You told me to show up at this widow's house. She doesn't have anything. You told me to eat her bread. She doesn't have bread. So I make her go make me bread, and I'm just staying at her house, hanging out, and you let her son die. What in the world? And so Elijah goes up, and 3 times he throws himself on this widow's son. And by the 3rd time, the widow's son is raised from the dead, is rescued, is saved. Maybe we're supposed to be reminded of that picture. I'm reminded of this picture from the last Super Bowl. This celebration with Andy Reid and Chris Jones. Andy Reid goes and lays down. When I watched this live, I was concerned for everyone involved. Right? I thought, this probably isn't good for Chris Jones. This isn't good for Andy Reid. And then as the coaches, this is my favorite part, he's like trying to get up. And I can relate. He's trying to get up. And he's like shoving, pushing himself into Chris Jones. And I was like, is he going to, what's going to happen here? And finally, people help him and he gets up. And so I'm not sure if that maneuver was helpful for anyone. But when Paul did it, it worked. And Eutychus is revived, and he stands up. And then last week we talked about, I made this lame joke because Scripture says, well, they were doing these extraordinary miracles. And it's like, well, when is the miracle ordinary? But that's kind of the picture here, isn't it? Because Luke is either unmoved or I don't know what's going on, but when he describes this kid is dead, and then he's not, and Paul has just body slammed him back to life, and then they just go up the stairs for supper, and they celebrate communion, and it's almost like, come on. But folks, there's no bigger party. There's no better celebration for one resurrection than to remember and celebrate the resurrection. Man, we ought to expect comfort from church. A long time ago, I'm not going to tell the whole story. You've heard it before. I was a youth pastor in Yuma, and our first daughter was born and died an hour after she was born. In the course of heading towards the hospital in a larger town in Arizona, in Phoenix from Yuma, we found out that the house we were living in, this condo or whatever, it was on fire. And so we're trying to sort that out, and we're heading to Phoenix. And so we're trying to figure out, what are we going to do? And is baby going to be okay? Is Sherry going to be okay? Where are we going to live when we come home? And all of that sort of stuff is happening. And it ends up that Katrina is born and passes away an hour after she's born. We're trying to figure out what do we do when we come home. An elder in the church that I was serving in Yuma said, look, I've got this rental. It's empty right now. You come back and you stay in that. And so just relief, right? Okay, I've got this. I couldn't handle any of the other stuff. Right? I couldn't really handle that, but it was handled for me. And there was just this relief. Okay, there's some place for me to bring my bride home to. While we were gone, the youth coaches that I served with in youth ministry, they went in and they cleaned up our stuff and they hauled it out of that apartment that was on fire, and they moved it all to this other place that we were staying. And so we not only, came home to this place where we could live, but there was, some place to sit and go to sleep, and all that stuff was good. And they provided for that. We saw this family the next Sunday actually after church. We were having lunch. This is what church people do. We go to lunch, and we saw this family in the same restaurant. We were having lunch, and they came over to us, and they said, hey, I know there's going to be some medical bills, associated with this. We want to pay for those medical bills. Right? So we had someplace to live. We had folks move our stuff, so we weren't cleaning up and managing water damage and all those sorts of things. And then the bills that weren't provided for by insurance were covered by this family, that's comfort. Right? That we ought to expect comfort in the church. I imagine that you've gone through seasons where that expectation wasn't met. Right? I'm so sorry about that. But I just want to remind you, and I would ask you to remember that as you gather together with your brothers and sisters in Christ every Sunday, and you eat that little piece of bread, that bread represents the Jesus' body broken for you on a cross. And you drink that cup of juice that represents his blood spilled for you. And I'd remind you that even if you're going through a season right now where you don't sense any comfort from God or his church or anyone, that he has provided for you in this huge way through his son Jesus to be reunited with him again someday. For this ultimate act in place of comfort. Return to paradise, to the garden, to walking in his presence. Man, we ought to expect comfort from his church. The third expectation is courage. Let's go ahead and take a look at verses 13 through 18. But going ahead to the ship, we set sail and intending to take Paul aboard there, for so he had arranged, intending himself to go by land. And when he met us at Assos, we took him on board and went to Mytilene, and sailing from there, we came the following day opposite Chios. I'm messing up these names bad, sorry. The next day we touched at Samos, and the day after we went to Miletus, for Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus so that he might not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hastening to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. Now, just think back through Paul's journey here. And we say, man, you ought to expect courage after meeting together. Paul goes from place to place, from town to town, all through his first missionary journey and his second missionary journey, and now on to his third missionary journey. In most of those places, Paul shows up in the synagogue, preaches for a while, gets chased out of the synagogue, and most of those places, eventually he gets chased out of town altogether. There's this opposition that is literally following Paul from place to place, from town to town, and it's opposition that has its start in Jerusalem. Right? Paul's decision to head back to Jerusalem, most of the opposition Paul faces, this isn't always true, but it's mostly true. Most of the opposition that Paul faces doesn't come from the Gentiles that he's preaching to and for, but from his Jewish brothers and sisters. Paul is essentially saying, hey, I need to get out of this frying pan, and I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into the fire. Right? I'm heading back to Jerusalem, where the opposition will absolutely be more intense. And Paul is courageous enough to head back. He says, we've got to go. He's delivering this offering. He's heading back to Jerusalem. He knows he needs to get there. He wants to get there in time for Pentecost. And so he decides to sail past Ephesus, and because he knows he'll be too comforted there in Ephesus. If he stops in Ephesus, it'll take too long. He'll find too much comfort. And so instead, he heads on to Jerusalem. He's just committed to this. It's an amazing story of courage that Paul finds somewhere. I don't know. There's so much noise around this election season and just in the media, and so much noise out there. And some of the noise I've been hearing is that believers shouldn't live in fear of the world, that the world's not out to get them. And I would agree with that. I think we come to that same conclusion from different places, though. Like, believers ought not be afraid of the world, but we shouldn't be afraid of the world, not because there's not a ruler of the air doing his best to bring destruction to the church. We ought not be afraid of the world, not because there's an enemy on a chain but tugging as hard as he can at that chain to get to whomever he can in the family of God. We ought not be afraid because the one who is in us is greater than he who is in the world. It's not because, man, the world, the enemy, isn't full of brokenness and chaos and sin, because it is. It's because we already have an answer to that brokenness and chaos and sin. It's Jesus. It's this source of courage. Paul, when he writes his letter to the Ephesians, he says, he prays this prayer in Ephesians at the end of Ephesians chapter 3. And in this prayer he says, I just want your eyes to be open to the power that God has imparted to you. Right? This big God has made a way to provide this power for every single one of his followers. And it's not power in the way that we necessarily think about it. It's not necessarily throw yourself on top of this guy and rescue him kind of power. But it's power for what? It's power, in the case of the letter to the Ephesians, to live out the last 3 chapters of the book of Ephesians, which talks about this is how you grow up in Jesus. This is how you mature in him. It's power to stand up to the threat and the temptation of the world around us. It's courage that we can't find anywhere else. And we ought to expect that when we come together that we are spurred on to good works by our gathering together. We can live with the same courage that Paul lived with in this last journey of his, heading back to Jerusalem. Well, you think about fall and schools back in session, and we're getting to fall. And I know some of you just want to get right past. Sherry brought home all this pumpkin spice stuff from the store. She went to a store, and she brought home all this pumpkin spice stuff. And I said, why do we have so much pumpkin spice? She said, well, the store only stocks one time with this stuff, and if you miss it, you'll miss it. And I wasn't sure what the best answer there was, right? Should we miss it, or do we need all this pumpkin spice stuff? But we have it now, and so we're going to enjoy fall. Some of you, though, are just ready. You're just like, let's get rid of that. Let's go straight to Jingle Bells and Silent Night and Christmas, and just God bless you. You know, you kind of irritate the rest of us, but just settle down. But God bless. Have you ever, you can be honest, this is a safe place. Have you ever been irritated by neighbors who leave their Christmas lights up too long? You know, you're like, you're going to make it to next Christmas, right? There's this lady, this widow, in 2020, 2021, who lived in this neighborhood, and right after Thanksgiving, her husband put up Christmas lights. He did this every year. And so he decorated the house with Christmas lights, and it looked great. And over the course of the holidays, he contracted COVID, and he died. And so after Christmas, you know, the neighbors started taking down their Christmas decorations. And this was the last thing her husband had done in the house, kind of thing. And he loved the Christmas lights. He did it every year. And she just couldn't get to the place where I'm taking down these decorations. And so the lights were still up when February rolled around. She opened her mailbox one day, and she took out her mail, and there was just this handwritten note in the mailbox that said, "It's February, take down your Christmas lights." And so she did something, I can't recommend this, right? She went on to the Facebook neighborhood chat thing, and she said, "Look, I'm so sorry. This is why my Christmas lights are up. My husband put them up after Thanksgiving. He died, contracted COVID and passed away, and I couldn't get to the place where I could take down these lights. I'm so sorry that it's irritated you." And then she left for vacation, which is the part I would recommend. If you're gonna post on one of those things, get out of town afterwards. Right? And so she heads off. She goes off, and she's gone a week or whatever, and she comes home, and you know what she came home to? All her neighbors, like the entire neighborhood, had these Christmas lights up. They'd put their decorations back up. Man, I know it's just some neighborhood, random folks, we don't know their names, but what a glorious picture of what the church ought to be, of community, of comfort, and a source of courage. Let's be that church, Wallula. Let's stand and worship him.